There's certainly a lot more classic gaming companies that I can look at when it comes to their Spectrum arcade ports, from the big guns like Data East and SNK to folks like Nichibitsu who probably got more Specky games than you'd think, but really it's high time that I looked at Taito, the long-time masters of the game centres, with an almost impossibly large list of classics to their name spread out over just about the entire history of the arcades. Obviously they've got quite a few games that we can look at here. And so this is the Taito selection. We've got 30 official ports, a couple that never got released, and a few notable games that are heavily inspired by their titles. There's the usual bunch by Ocean that you might expect, but there's a good few more that weren't done by them and were instead handled by the likes of Firebird, Quicksilver and Virgin. And generally, we'll be doing fine here, but there is certainly the opportunity for some quirkiness along the way. Anyway, let's get into it. It makes sense to start with the Ocean titles, almost all of which were released through their Imagine Software label starting from around 1987. I might not have mentioned this before, but initially Ocean's acquisition of Imagine and use of it was originally meant to be purely for arcade ports of Konami games. However, when Konami decided, foolishly, to go out on their own and make a load of crap for the computer, Ocean naturally went knocking on other companies' doors, and Taito were one of the first on the list. And Ocean absolutely did right by them. We have 15 proper ports here, and a big chunk of them are absolute essentials, some of the best ports you can find on the humble Specky. However, I think we'll start with a simple little game of block smashing. Arkanoid arrived on the ZX Spectrum in 1987, only a year or so after the original's arcade release, which isn't too bad, although it's not exactly the most advanced arcade game or anything. Not that it needs to be, it's Breakout on steroids after all. That said, porting a game like Arkanoid to the Specky is still a bit challenging when it comes to recreating the original's gloriously analogue paddle controls. Mike Lamb, the man behind this port, does make a bit of an attempt. The bat does have a couple of different speeds depending on how long you hold the key down for, like it's attracted to the ball somewhat. It's not too bad, but it's never quite going to be as good as analogue, of course. Sometimes you can go slow when you mean to go fast, or vice versa, and that'll catch you out. I wouldn't say that this is the best Ocean version of the original Arkanoid, for me that honour goes to the Amstrad CPC port, but it's still not bad at all. One funny fact here is that the music for this version of the game was composed by the almighty Mark R. Jones, a scene legend who's perhaps more noted for great artwork than music. He did a fine job, but he did the music using a utility by Melbourne House called the Music Box, not realising that using such a thing would require a licence. Ocean ultimately did have to pay a bit of cash to Melbourne House for using the software, and Mark got a bit of a bollocking from Gary Bracey as a result. But hey, still decent music regardless. Naturally, Arkanoid Revenge of Doe would follow soon after, released in 1988 and still programmed by Mike Lamb. This one is pretty meh, if I'm honest. The different speed of the Batty is gone, opting for a straight digital control. Not as good as analogue, but it's fine. I don't particularly like the mix of colour and monochrome that the game goes for, I have to say. I find that it looks rather busy and that sometimes it's kind of hard to track the ball. The game also lacks a bit of speed compared to the original arcade port, and it sometimes does feel like the collision detection is a teensy-weensy bit off. It's quite an average port indeed. We're not quite done with Arkanoid yet, mind you. When we get to the Inspired section, we're going to see the game that took the official ports of Arkanoid and smashed them to smithereens. But that's going to come later. Okay, let's go to the first of a few absolute full-blooded classics. Chase H.Q is a brilliant arcade game, one of the best driving games of the late 80s and one that, if you didn't know better, you might think that the Spectrum would struggle with. I have covered this one a little bit before, mind you, so you may know that that is not the case. Utilising a souped up version of the engine from Mike Lamb's conversion of WEC Le Mans, the duo of John O'Brien and Bill Harbison combined for an absolute belter, one of the classic examples of graphical limitations not mattering when it comes to a near perfect recreation of the original's gameplay. It's quick enough, plays utterly smoothly, and manages to get in just about every necessary feature. You've still got the classic speech even if it's in text form, although there is room for a couple of audio samples. The rest of the audio's damn fine too. Great music and sound from Jonathan Dunn. Everything about the game just feels, well, it feels utterly like Chase HQ. Every bit as entertaining as the arcade it came from. Speeding around with nitro and bashing the hell out of a perp's car is absolute magic. When you consider that it's not like these are direct ports at all, that they're recreations that had to be done by hand in a pretty short time span, and usually with no resources beyond the arcade machine itself, it's truly phenomenal work. It's very close between this and the Amstrad CPC version, which is an absolute stunner as well. And hey, if there's one thing that Speccy and Amstrad owners can agree on, it's that they can both laugh at the poor sod C64 owners who ended up getting a calamitous port. Hell, they could even laugh at the Sharpex 68000 folk as well if they wanted to. Those boys took one hell of a beating. A wonderful, wonderful version of the game that simply cannot be faulted. The same, alas, cannot be said of the sequel. Chase HQ 2 Special Criminal Investigation is certainly here, and while it's not necessarily a bad game or anything, it doesn't quite have the original game's charm. I guess the same could be said of the original arcade, if I'm being honest. It doesn't move too badly, and it at least gives the impression of being full screen even if basically everything's happening in the bottom half, and naturally you can also shoot bad guys this time around. But it all just feels a little bit more jankier in a way that's trickier to define. Maybe it just feels more generic too. Bonus points for having a thoroughly freaking depressing game over screen, mind you. This one's just a little bit mediocre. I kind of feel it would be a bit higher rated if the original port didn't exist at all, if that makes sense. We're still operating at a pretty high level as we get to the next duo of games. Operation Wolf is another icon, and it also gets a fabulous treatment on the Speccy, this time from the prolific duo of Andrew Deakin and Ivan Horn, with Jonathan Dunn doing the business on Sonics. It's one of those things where somehow they've managed to capture a little bit of the original's magic. I mean, there's a whole load of shooting gallery type games like Operation Wolf, both in the arcade and on the Speccy, but something in the presentation and fluidity makes the game a gem to play, and you even feel that without the obvious joy of having a massive Uzi 9mm light gun to play the game with. It's just really good. Speaking of guns, there is a special version of the game that does support the Speccy's light gun, the Magnum Light Phaser, which is great, so long as you were one of the half dozen or so people who owned a Magnum Light Phaser that actually frickin' worked. You're best off playing this with keyboard or joystick, and you'll still have a terrific time doing that, even if there is a pretty good chance that you will ultimately sustain a lethal injury and be finished. Here. Smashing game, and another port that is hard to find much issue with at all. The same largely can be said of Operation Thunderbolt, at least in Speccy form. It is, after all, more of the same, and you're going to have a jolly good laugh here if you enjoyed the original. I suppose there is one odd thing that I can mention. Deakin and Horn decided to dispense of the crosshair in their version of the game, which is a bit weird, especially considering that unlike the original's port, Thunderbolt does not support the Magnum Light Phaser. That seems sensible considering the awful quality of said peripheral, but then the original arcade sequel also didn't use Operation Wolf's light gun technology, opting for a massive Uzi 9mm shaped joystick instead. As it is, Operation Thunderbolt is a game where you're not likely to stop firing for any reason, and you can still see where you're shooting while doing that, so it doesn't actually affect gameplay too much, but I do still find it a bit of an odd decision. In any case, it's another fun time spent saving hostages and shooting literally thousands of terrorists, insurgents, and general bad guys in the name of America. The New Zealand story is, I think, one of those games that's kind of obscure in places like the States, but is very well known and loved over here in Europe, and a lot of that has to do with the various quite excellent microcomputer versions of it, such as the Amiga one that was included in the hugely successful Batman pack, and this one right here for the Spectrum. This version of the game may not have too much in the way of colour, opting for the kind of typical by now monochrome display that games opted for in the late 80s, but the sprites, speed, and ludicrously catchy music definitely make up for it. It's a good enough port of the game for it to instantly become one of the Speccy's top platformers. Perhaps more noticeable than anything else is just how many sprites the game throws at you. There's a lot going on without much in the way of slowdown, a triumph of multiplexing that's usually credited to technical wizard Paul Hughes. In the end, there's very little indeed to dislike here. It's a tough as hell game to be sure, but one that keeps you coming back every time. Definitely a recommended port. Time to relax with a little bit of puzzling action. We've got conversions of Plottin and Puzznic, two 1989 vintage arcade games based around tile matching. They share quite a lot of similarities, although the mechanics are different. Plottin has you shooting tiles at a block of them and matching that way, while Puzznic has you moving them around and trying to clear every tile in a problem. Both of them are quite okay, although I'd definitely say that of the two games, I prefer Plottin, as chucking the titles in there haphazardly is much more my style. And both of them get perfectly fine Specky ports. They're not exactly raising the bar in any way, but ports of games like these aren't going to run into an awful lot of problems on a computer like this one, and they both did absolutely fine as a result. I think people might remember Puzznic a little bit more. It kind of surprises me that Puzznic ended up getting a hit squad release while Plottin didn't, but there you go. Not bad at all if you fancy a little bit of casual thinking as a break from those more typical and mindlessly violent punching and shooty computer games we all know and love. Speaking of which, here's another classic, one that we've covered in full quite recently, but it's always worth seeing again. Renegade is another one of the absolute best games here. Mike Lamb's conversion of this quintessential and influential throwdown isn't exactly missing anything at all. In fact, I would even go as far as to say that this is the best version of the game, and that includes the original arcade. It's so good that this is the first thing that comes to mind when I think of Renegade. It was rightly a massive hit indeed. It's got the lot. When I covered the game recently, a lot of you folks shared your love of it too. It's clearly one of the big Specky titles that so many people remember and still enjoy to this day. Another triumph. And yes, of course, there's the microcomputer sequels too. Target to Renegade is certainly at least worth mentioning here again, seeing as it's essentially Ocean's unofficial Double Dragon game after they couldn't quite get the rights to it, and is also a brilliant game. Oh, and there will be a bit more on Double Dragon when we cover it in a little bit. Renegade 3 is, of course, a disaster that barely warrants mentioning at all, the one where our hero time travels and loses almost all of his frames of animation as a result. But yeah, the original is a glorious title indeed. Right, here we go. The best port of the whole video. There's some really great ones here, to be sure, but Rainbow Islands? This is a very special game indeed. The sequel to Bubble Bobble, where Bub and Bob take on their human form and make their way through these various themed worlds by spewing out rainbows everywhere they go, is a signature microcomputer game. Indeed, this is a gem on every single computer it came out on, and the Speccy is certainly no exception. It is a bit of an odd one in various ways. After all, the game doesn't come out of the Ocean Dungeon as such, instead being made by the almighty Graft Gold, the independent studio responsible for the likes of Uridium and Paradroid. Hell, there's a possibility this port may never have come out at all, which would have been a crying shame. It would have originally been released by Telecomsoft through the Firebird label, the same company that had previously put out an excellent port of Bubble Bobble that we'll be seeing later. However, it fell by the wayside when Telecomsoft was sold to Microprose in 1989. Happily, the boys from Manchester picked it back up. The limitations of the Spectrum don't seem to matter at all with a port like this. Not only is the gameplay thoroughly on point with the same constant firing of rainbows, the makeshift platforming and the various enemies and all that, but the graphics are too. I mean, just look at how colourful it is. This game's quite the antidote compared to the monochrome stylings of a lot of games from this period, really. It's bursting with bright colours everywhere and no colour clash to be found. All this plus in-game music and sound effects too. Sure, they may slow down a little from time to time, but this is a game that's absolutely pushing the 128K spectrum to the limit, and that huge amount of effort results in the very best. Most magazines would class this as one of the best games to ever come out on the Speccy, and that sort of honour is more than deserved. Again, Rainbow Islands may not be as well known in most circles as the original Bubble Bobble, but in the land of the UK microcomputers, the game is, quite rightly, legendary. We go back in time a bit to 1987, and one of the lesser lights here. The Legend of Kage is a more simple game when compared to some of the ones we've seen in this video, and it's one that you might expect to get a decent port. But alas, this one misses the mark. It's kind of trying, but the flowing gameplay from the arcade is replaced by something that's a great deal more jerky, and one that feels considerably more unfair. Hell, sometimes it seems like it's damn near impossible to jump anywhere without flying straight into a ninja, and you don't feel nearly as well equipped for the fight now. It's just not really all that fun anymore, I'm afraid. The game does have canvas software associated with it, which may well explain a fair bit about the low quality here. In the words of Simon Butler, who had the misfortune of working on this and other canvas games, Legend of Kage and other canvas titles sullied the good name of shite. This is one of those games that was heavily mooted at one point for a Hit Squad re-release, and while rumours occasionally stir up of it actually getting one, it never happened. And well, perhaps that's for the best. Straight on to something a hell of a lot better. Rastan is another jewel of a conversion for the Speccy that does a stellar job indeed. Again, you've just got to put the obvious technical limitations to one side, and you can see that the sprites are appropriately big, there's a good deal of colour, there's in-game music, there's everything you need for a fine take on Taito's Conan 'em up. This game got some pretty superb ports in general, and while perhaps this isn't as great as the almighty Master System version, it's not that far off, in all honesty. It feels every bit as meaty and as heroic as the original arcade, and the team behind this one did a tremendous job. Slap Fight is another arcade port that comes from a more outside source, this time Probe Software. In fact, it's kind of possible that the almighty duo of Dave Perry and Nick Bruti worked on it. Nick Bruti is certainly credited anyway. Toaplan's highly popular shooter is certainly a ripe one for a Speccy conversion, but this one misses the mark. The thing I really don't like about this one is simple. A whole lot of fins seem to flicker a lot, including, quite crucially, the enemy's shots. It can be tricky already to pick up enemy shots on a busy monochrome background as it is, but when they're also flickering? Yeah. Most of the time when I died in this game, I frankly had no idea whatsoever what killed me. I can't recommend this one at all, I'm afraid. There are far better top-down shoot-em-ups to be found on the Speccy, and we're even going to be seeing one of them a bit later on. The final Ocean conversion of a Taito game was Space Gun, and it actually did come out as late as April of 1992. Handled by Imagers, it has to be said that this is, well, it's seriously ambitious. Sure, it's kind of like Operation Wolf, only in space, but you can forget about monochrome here, as Space Gun vomits colour from every alien orifice, complete with huge creations to match. Big monsters made out of multiple parts all round, exploding limbs, face huggers. Jesus. Sure, it can become very busy and very messy at times when there's more than one of these big monsters on screen, but it's still quite cool to see on the, by now, completely ancient ZX Spectrum. It's one of the final games that Ocean released for the Speccy, full stop, and it's just fine on the whole. It's certainly good to see a whole load of effort being put in on a game by a big studio in 1992, it must be said. Good stuff. There's one particular big name from Taito that, quite famously, Ocean didn't manage to snag, that being Double Dragon, a game you might well have expected them to do, considering their success with the likes of Renegade. While Ocean did release a C64 version of DD years later, the main brunt of games in the series were released through Melbourne House, a label with a somewhat complex story behind it. Originally the British publishing wing of Australian studio Beam Software, they were sold to Mastertronic in 1987. Mastertronic were flying pretty high at the time, but a disastrous attempt to break into the arcades proved to be nearly fatal, and they merged with Virgin in 1988. We will be seeing a couple more Virgin branded Taito games later, but this was the only one to come through Melbourne House, and it was sent over to the generally quite capable Binary Design. However, this port would be a right bloody disaster. On the very surface of things, Double Dragon might not look too terrible in screenshot form, but when you see it moving, oh good lord. The graphics are really quite hideous, in all honesty. The sprites barely even look like their arcade counterparts, and everything moves so slowly. Not even the colour that's kicking around can save this. But trying to actually play the thing is where everything really falls down. There aren't exactly a great deal of great beat-em-ups on the Spectrum, but it's hard to think of one that's quite as unresponsive and shoddy as Double Dragon. Collision detection is thoroughly balked. Abobos in particular are an absolute nightmare, seemingly able to hit Billy and Jimmy from anywhere even when they're not on the same level as you. Completely minimal sound effects don't exactly help here either. It almost feels unfair to compare this to something like Renegade. The original predecessor to Double Dragon feels like it's years ahead of it when it comes to the Speccy versions. Good grief, does this game stink! It is by some distance the worst port featured in this video. I suppose if there was any small comfort for Speccy owners, it's that just about every other micro-platform got horrid versions of Double Dragon 2. It makes you wonder what on earth happened. I mean, the guys credited on the ports are pretty capable people, by all accounts. And well, there is something of a story here. Essentially a story of the original team that Binary Design assigned to the project, apparently making a pig's ear out of the whole thing. Most of the detail here comes from Nick Speakman, who project managed these various versions and was interviewed by the Double Dragon Dojo some years ago. It appears that Virgin became aware that the conversion was a total mess and told Binary Design to redo everything. And yes, that means everything. The whole game, all of the graphics, the whole bloody lot. In 2 weeks. For almost every version, 8 and 16-bit. Even the very best programmers and artists would likely struggle under these conditions, but that's what happens when a game's got to be rushed out for Christmas 1988. In the end, only one of the micro versions of Double Dragon was even remotely worthy of the name, the Amstrad CPC 1281, which was the work of that great master of fixer-uppers, the enigmatic Richard Applin. The rest of them, though? Yeah, it was brutal. No wonder the final product turned out the way it did, in all honesty. So much for the original Double Dragon then. While the other 2 games weren't distributed by Taito and thus don't really belong, it's obviously worth looking at them here. It saves on doing a Techno Speccy Ports video, I suppose. Double Dragon 2 The Revenge is another quite interesting one. For binary design it is something of a redemption one, but there are 2 quite different versions of the game for the Speccy, a 128K and a 48K one. One is fine, and the other is, well, you'll see. The 128K version is happily a far better attempt at DD than the original was. It may be a bit monochrome now, but the game actually moves at a decent speed. There's more enemies, more moves and fluid controls, arcade accurate animation, a bit of music here and there, the sprites are well drawn. It feels a hell of a lot more like Double Dragon, that's for sure. If you had a 128K Speccy, all was good, and you actually had a game that was comparable to the arcade experience. At last. But if you had a 48K Speccy, then God help you. It's not usual to have 2 versions that are so different, but I guess Virgin or whoever wanted to cover all bases. However, this 48K version is a catastrophe. The graphics are similar, except the display has been rather haphazardly cut in half, leaving a completely empty bottom of the screen. A ton of animation is completely missing, and the whole thing seems very messy indeed. Worst of all though, this is absolutely broken. You can beat the entire thing in about 2 minutes, not counting loading times, just by spamming the jump kick. In the 128K version, the jump kick doubles as a special move and is essentially lethal to most enemies, but it's not easy at all to hit. Here, well, you can hit it way easier, and you can kill every enemy in one hit without exception. From the most generic thug all the way up to Big Willie himself, they drop like flies, utterly torn asunder. So yeah, you just hold for the jump kick for 2 minutes, and then you win. This staggered me at first. I had to go play a different TZX of the game just to make sure that what I played hadn't been tampered with or had some God mode poke stuck on it or whatever, but I only found the same thing. It really makes you wonder why they bothered doing a 48K version at all, frankly. I pity any poor sod who ended up stuck with this one. And yes, there was a port for the 3rd Double Dragon game, the Rosetta Stone. A quite late one, not coming out until around late 91, early 92, and there's no Virgin or binary design involved this time. This was handled by the newly independent Sales Curve, who released it through their Storm label. Is this any better than what we've already seen? Well, it's not as good as the 128K DD2, but is by default better than everything else, although it is always going to be a bit hampered by Double Dragon 3 not being a good game to begin with. The graphics aren't too badly done, all told, but the main trouble with this one, again, is that it's incredibly easy, and thus somewhat mindless. The kick in particular is completely overpowered, with a big range that means most enemies can't get anywhere near our heroes. Once you figure this out, well, I guess you just play the game for as long as you can stand it, whether that's long enough to beat it or not. I certainly have a memory of beating the game back in the day when I was about 7, so it surely must have been an absolute piece of piss. Anyway, Double Dragon 3 caps off what is, in general, a pretty lousy showing indeed for the series on the Spectrum, and indeed most other micro-platforms. I'd say that it's a crying shame that Ocean didn't end up getting all of the rights to this series, but then the Double Dragon game they eventually released for the C64 was also a right duffer, so perhaps in this instance a good set of ports just wasn't meant to be. Outside of the usual Ocean mob, there are a few other companies who happen to release games by Taito, and as it happens there's some pretty good games here too, particularly from the likes of Firebird and Virgin, who definitely managed to pick out some of the best ones that Ocean didn't manage to grab up. And we start with one of the most iconic Taito games of them all. The original Bubble Bobble was snagged by Firebird and released on the Speccy and most other micros in 1987, and in the case of the Spectrum version, the port was developed by Software Creations, a name that we've obviously seen a few times in the past, and usually famous for the music of one Timothy Follin. You might expect a single screen game like Bubble Bobble to work well on the computers, and you would be right. When it came to just about every version of this game, Firebird utterly slam-dunked it, publishing a whole load of fantastic ports, and the Speccy is no exception. Is there anything really missing from this version of Bubble Bobble? I mean, hardly. I guess you could say that someone forgot to colour Bub and Bob in, but the cackload of colour in the rest of the game more than makes up for that. The entire myriad of levels are here, and so are the game's hidden secrets. And yes, the music's here too. That legendary, ridiculously catchy earworm is, as you might expect from Software Creations, flawlessly recreated. That is, unless you're playing the Hit Squad version of the game. The music was sadly not present in that version for whatever reason. But if you like Bubble Bobble, and let's face it, most people do, you'll find a tremendous version here, just as you'd find one on the Amiga, the Commodore 64, the Atari ST. Okay, the Amstrad CPC got a pretty lousy port, but everything else is great. A fine version of one of the best arcade games of all time. Sticking with Firebird, we've got a version of Flying Shark coming up, and this one brings back the almighty Graft Gold, the folks who made that port of Rainbow Islands. And once again we've got a Spectrum port that demonstrates this studio's incredibly high standard. As a matter of fact, this might just be the best top-down shoot-'em-up on the Speccy. You may have some monochrome graphics here, but they are detailed and, crucially, the enemy's bullets don't get lost in the mire. You can always easily see what you're doing and what you need to dodge. And yes, the arcade action is recreated pretty faithfully. It's certainly not short of enemy planes, tanks, turrets and other ne'er-do-wells to blow up, and it'll definitely give you a firm test of your shoot-'em-up skills. While there's quite a few disappointing top-down shooters on the Speccy, this is absolutely not one of them. A high quality and very recommended port. Up next, we have another very well-known Taito game, Elevator Action. I think this one wins the award for the longest time between the original arcade and the Spectrum port. While the arcade came out in 1983, this port didn't come out until 1987, and it was developed by Quicksilver, a pretty strong studio in the system's early years. Is this port worth waiting for? Actually, yes. It's another very good one, so long as you enjoy the arcade. It's certainly a game that the Speccy's comfortable with. You've got every detail from the little intro to shooting out the lights, and it's not like the graphics have really taken that much of a hit, in all honesty. There is one big difference, I suppose. The music in the Speccy version, composed by David Whittaker, is certainly a lot more intense than the arcade. I mean, just take a listen. That might make the game feel a little different. Now, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of the original Elevator Action, but I would struggle to find a whole lot wrong with this port, in all honesty. We're off to the racetrack now, and we return to Virgin. Unlike their previous overseeing of Double Dragon, these next two games were published under their own name, and they're both quality titles again. 'Tis nice when you've generally got decent stuff to play with. Continental Circus is a perfectly good port of a Formula 1 inspired racer where you not only have to face down the clock, but you also have to overtake as many other cars as possible in order to qualify for the next race, all the while avoiding a crash that will result in a costly trip to the pits. There's a few more things to consider here than in most other arcade races, and you'll find them all present and correct here on the Speccy version, along with other important factors such as a good sense of speed and a decent set of sound effects, complete with an inoffensive engine note. The game may be a little lacking in colour compared to the likes of WEC Le Mans, but it's not all that bad. Up next, the Ninja Warriors. Now this is kind of an obscure one, I think. I wasn't even aware that Ninja Warriors got a port to the Speccy until quite recently, but here we are. Now you might think that this would be a bit over ambitious, seeing as it's a port of one of Taito's triple wide games that used 3 screens in the arcade, but that always seemed kinda gimmicky in the case of this game. Ninja Warriors is totally fine when it uses 1 screen only. Now I'm not a big fan of all that much in the arcade game aside from Daddy Mulk, but this is a totally acceptable conversion. It's fine if you like very straightforward side-scrolling beat-em-ups. It doesn't move too badly, and it's certainly throwing enough enemies at you to keep you busy. What more do you want? Again, if I'm purely looking at the accuracy of the conversion and how it copes with the obvious limitations of the Speccy, Ninja Warriors does a good job. Hooray for monochrome side-scrollers. Sticking with side-scrollers, we move to the one official port in this video at least, from Elite, and it's something of an intriguing one. Here's a game that most people probably know as Gladiator, but here on the Speccy it's given a wholly new title of The Great Gurianos, Gurianos being the name of the arcade game's hero. There's big sprites, you do a bit of side-scrolling, then you get into a sword fight, reaching out with your blade and defending with your shield, in a similar vein to the earlier Taito arcade Great Swordsman. You get most of this in the Speccy version, including some pretty impressive large sprites, but gameplay wise the game does kind of fall down a bit. It's quite jerky, the side-scrolling sections are a real pain in the neck to get through, and the fighting doesn't really make up for it. What's more intriguing is the guy who made this port. It's an early game from one of the more famous names to come from the Spectrum years, David Perry. It's also a port that he really doesn't like, considering it one of the worst games he ever produced. As he confirmed to a World of Spectrum forum user in 2004, Great Gurianos is actually impossible to even finish due to there being not enough memory to include an ending. The last boss was therefore made impossible to defeat. So yeah, there's a historical curiosity here, but it's not a good game. Quite obscure too. Originally it was only released as part of Elite's Trio compilation in 1987, which is always a sign of exceptionally high quality. Best to dodge this one. Our next software house is one with a name that's somewhat infamous. Yes, it's The Edge. The Tim Landell boys have kicked around on the sidelines of a couple of these Speccy ports vids thanks to games like Alien Syndrome and Shaolin's Road, and they've got 2 Taito ports in their arsenal. Sadly, neither of them are any good. First up is a quite popular game indeed, Darius, another one of Taito's big triple-wide cabinets, and a very famous horizontal shooter. This one starts out promising with a fairly snazzy intro and pretty logos, as far as the Speccy goes, and that may make you think you're in for a treat. Unfortunately, it's a doggy treat that's been rotting in a cupboard for 30 years. This is one of the biggest examples I can think of for graphics ruining bloody everything. The main problem with the game is that everything is way too big. Big ship, cramped environment, and tons of projectiles? Yeah. Good luck avoiding any of them. It's kind of amusing considering that this is Darius, a game that purposefully expanded the field to make your ship look quite small in comparison to everything else. Not good at all, this port. One of the worst in the whole video, in fact. Hopefully not too many people were deceived by the screenshots. The second Edge game is a much more obscure one. Chained Sleena is not exactly the first Taito arcade on anybody's lips, but it's here on the Speccy under a brand new name, Soldier of Light. This game is by Cyberdyne, a little studio that I have actually covered a fair bit before, back when I looked at the Bobby Yaz show, and happily it's a much better port than Darius. Still not great or anything, but it's at least okay. The game itself is a sort of jack of all trades and master of none. You've got levels where you do platforming and run and gunning, and they're followed by generic space shooter affairs. There isn't exactly a whole lot of anything to say here, as a rather humdrum arcade game results in a competent yet also humdrum Spectrum port, but it's thoroughly inoffensive. Finally in this section, we have the appearance of the biggest Taito name of them all. Well, in its updated form anyway. The Speccy port of Super Space Invaders 91 comes from Domark, and as you might expect, it's quite a late game, coming out in, well, 1991. It's kind of funny to have this appear so late, considering the 1,000,001 unofficial Space Invaders games that appeared on the system, but here we are. And sadly this isn't a particularly good version of the game. The monochrome graphics combined with busy backgrounds really doesn't do Space Invaders any favours, and it all runs a bit slow when compared with some of the best unofficial ones. I think Super Space Invaders is a pretty cool update, and it's very enjoyable indeed on a few other platforms, but the Speccy version really isn't one of them. And with that, well, we're just about done with the official Taito arcades. But we're not done with the video. We still have to get a bit of info about games that could have possibly come out but didn't, and there's certainly some goodies to find in the unofficial and inspired section. Let's not dilly-dally. There's not a huge amount here in the Unreleased section, and unfortunately there's nothing that's actually ended up being leaked, but there is one quite curious game here for sure, that one being Toki. Toki would have been released by Ocean Software in 1991, and indeed it was released on most platforms. There's Amiga and ST versions, of course, but also a Commodore 64 one. However, versions for the Spectrum and Amstrad CPC never materialised, despite both of them being previewed and even advertised. There's a few screenshots floating around for both of these versions as a result, and we know that Keith Tinman of Special Effects was working on the Speccy port. However, there were reports of delays on the Speccy version that would have pushed it to sometime early in '92, and from there, it just didn't come out at all. It's been posited that the game might have just been a little too ambitious for the Speccy and Amstrad, and this also dovetails with Ocean's decision to fold up Special Effects in 1991, which again could be another reason why this port didn't end up coming out. There are actually quite good fan versions of Toki for both the Spectrum and Amstrad these days, if you're desperate to get a fix of A-pin on these micros, so it's not all bad news. A fair bit less is known about the other two games I found tidbits on, Volfied and Euro Football Champ. There really is just the tiniest tidbit of info on Volfied, a little preview in Your Sinclair from June 1991 that says it would be released by Empire Software, with no screenshots or anything like that. One presumes that this port of the souped-up Keeks arcade didn't get very far. Similarly, there's very little on a port of Euro Football Champ, just a couple of news items from Crash and Your Sinclair indicating that the game would be released by Domark and would be out in either late 1991 or early 1992. The tidbits are a little conflicting. One describes the game as a top-down affair, which doesn't exactly sound a lot like the Taito game, while the other flat out says it's a conversion of the coin-op with a view from the grandstand and the arcade's signature flying knees and punches. In any case, there's no screenshots or anything, so it's hard to confirm either way. Both of these games were presumably binned fairly quickly, which is always a risk considering how late in the day both these games were set to come out in. Both games did end up getting 16-bit ports to the Amiga and ST, mind you. The Amiga port of Volfied is actually very good indeed and quite close to the arcade, while the port of Euro Football Champ is not quite as impressive, to say the least. Okay, here's our final section. We can't not mention some of the unofficial games here, really. There's a lot of unofficial versions of Taito games, and some of them are definitely worth looking at. I mean, we've even got a text adventure version of one game here. And of course, we do have the biggest game that we've not seen much of yet, that being the original Space Invaders. There was no official port of Space Invaders to the Spectrum, but there were certainly many versions of it, especially in the system's first couple of years, from early starlets to the most basic of tie-ins, tie-pins, to around 3 or so just in the Cassette 50 compilation tape alone. There's a hell of a lot of ways to play Space Invaders on your Spectrum. I could be here for a long time going through the best and the worst ones, but really I just want to pick out one that absolutely stood out over the rest, all the way back in 1982, easily one of the best games of the Spectrum's very first year. The game in question is simply called Invaders, and it was released by Artic. As there's lots of Space Invaders clones that are just called Invaders, this one's usually known as Artic Invaders, to differentiate it from the myriad of others. This port here, as you can clearly see, is excellent. Hell, it's pretty damn fully featured, with all the colours, the UFO, the appropriate sound and everything else. Sure, it's only Space Invaders, but you would be surprised how many of these clones got details or even fundamentals about the game completely wrong. The best thing really is that it's full speed, meaning that it moves just like the arcade too. Plenty of us know the pain of playing a bad and basic version of Space Invaders, so this one is an absolute godsend. And it's doing this in only 16K. You could happily play this on the most basic and cheapest of ZX Spectrums. Artic might be best known nowadays for their role in US Gold's World Cup Carnival fiasco, but they were a premier developer in the Spectrum's infancy, and this version of Space Invaders is most certainly their crowning achievement, one that manages to feel damn near exactly like the world-changing arcade game. Here's another one inspired by an early and popular Taito game, Zolyx, a version of Keeks. This one makes a slight change to the gameplay, although I'm not sure if it's one that's welcome. You can't be drawing for more than a couple of seconds or you'll get automatically killed. I don't much care for this, as it kind of removes the risk-reward element of the game and the satisfaction of managing to get a huge chunk of the board filled in one. You kind of just have to do it in little pieces here and there. So yeah, this one's pretty meh. Speaking of meh, there's also this version of Lunar Rescue here that's called, Lunar Rescue. This is kind of here as a bread and butter example of the typical basic version of a very old arcade game, the sort of thing that's familiar to quite a lot of Speccy owners, especially the early adopters. It's not the worst basic version I've ever seen, far from it, but it's probably not going to get the blood flowing. Up next, I have a trio from a budget studio that kind of had a track record when it came to making cheaper versions of more famous arcade games, that being Players Premium. Such games comprise a big chunk of their library, and it might be worth looking at them in full one day, but for now here are 3 Taito ones: Subway Vigilante, LA Drugs Bust, and Havoc. Subway Vigilante is, as you can see, a take on Renegade, and not a good one. It kind of takes ages to actually kill any of the enemies for a start. They're attracted to you like a fly to shite, and it's hard to do much except hit one punch on a single enemy before running off. Not one of their best. LA Drugs Bust is definitely a little better, so long as you like the Operation Wolf style of play. It's not as good as the original by any stretch, but it still provides a few minutes of shooty action. Not exactly all that bad for a couple of quid. And lastly, Havoc is an example of a player's game that's actually quite good. A very solid top-down shooter that's inspired by Tiger Heli. Tiger Heli didn't get an official micro port, but you can certainly see the similarity and, yeah, this one's not too bad at all. Again, players might be worth a video of their own just because they have a whole load of Jimmy Hart versions of games like this and, well, perhaps that could be interesting. Oh, and they've got Joe Blade, of course. One last thing here, going back to LA Drugs Bust. This game was also the basis for a player's cover tape exclusive called A Nightmare on Robinson Street that appeared in 1990 on the front of issue 50 of Your Sinclair. In this game, you go to a street that's quite clearly Ramsey Street from the recently deceased TV soap opera Neighbours, and you shoot everything in sight before they take pictures of you. The stars, the paparazzi, the cameramen, everything except the cute dogs running about, of course. The title screen describes this as your worst nightmare or your ultimate fantasy, presumably depending on your feelings towards old and cack Australian soaps. In fairness, it is at least 1,000 times better than the officially licensed Neighbours game. Right, here's a couple of really good ones. We have a lot of inspiration from Taito classics in this duo, and they kind of stand out on their own. Mission Elevator, developed by Eurogold and coming out exclusively on US Gold's Kicks label, takes elevator action as a template and creates a game that's got a bit more in the way of adventure touches. You can do a lot of searching, you have to find keys to open doors, you can even do thoroughly kooky things like sit down to have a rest, or pause to play some dice, and naturally there's a stream of enemy agents for you to shoot as you go up the complex. It plays kind of like a mixture between elevator action and impossible mission, I would say, and it is actually quite enjoyable. A game that I really liked playing when I was a kid, and it's still pretty fun now. And hey, this was only ever a budget title on the Spectrum. It's definitely a very good game for the low cost of $2.99. I'd say it's well worth having a look at. One other game that I can't not mention here, of course, is Batty. A game that certainly takes the Arkanoid formula of heavily beefing up Breakout, but absolutely knocks the official ports of Arkanoid into a cocked hat. It's full speed, big graphics, lots of creative power-ups and levels, and a few touches that really make the game its own. Batty is quite a special game for a lot of Speccy owners, because it's possibly the best freebie in the history of the system. Almost inexplicably, Elite Systems chose not to release the game on its own, instead sending it off to Your Sinclair, who put it on a cover tape in October of 1987. A fully fledged Spectrum classic on the front of a magazine? Back in 1987, that was a much rarer thing than what happened during the days of the cover tape wars. Elite eventually would put out standalone releases of Batty through the Budget Encore label, but this is without question the greatest game that found its way to the public through the cover tapes, and the best Arkanoid type game on the Spectrum by a long distance. A classic. And finally, well, we've got something strange. I would have expected to find a game by players or whoever that tried to use Bubble Bobble as an influence, but nothing really came up in my hunt. People didn't dare try it, it seemed. Instead, well, I found a text adventure. And no, I'm not joking. Here's Bubble Bobble the Adventure, a Russian game from 1993 that's been translated into English. The only game from a man named Anton Z. Player, this short little adventure sees Bub and Bob go to New York and solve a few simple puzzles, such as using your bubbles to destroy the Statue of Liberty to go left. Humdrum things like that. The funniest thing about this is the translation and the voice it uses. It's like an attempt at doing a classic New York accent, only in thoroughly broken English. You might have a teensy bit of trouble getting your commands through as a result, but it's not exactly a long game, only about 5 minutes, if that. The end of the game promises a second part and a battle with something called Big Sprite, but alas, this second part never came to pass. What an odd little title though, the sort of thing where you wonder how it ended up in the wild at all, but it kind of shows the Speccy's worldly qualities. And well, that's it for Taito. On the whole, we've had an excellent selection here. There's only been a few duffers, and a lot of the games here have been amongst the best ports you'll find on the system. It's fair to make an argument for Taito being the best handled classic arcade company of them all on the system, considering the quality of the likes of Rainbow Islands, Chase HQ, Renegade, New Zealand Story, and a fair few others. But there's still a few more that we can look at in the future. Data East, SNK, and Namco certainly have a good few games kicking about, and this sort of video is always a fun one to return to. But until then, all that's left is for me to thank you for watching, and to say, as ever, bye for now.